Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Nestler. I'm a faculty member in the IT Analytics and Operations Department here at Mendoza, and I'd like to welcome you to the first event of Ethics Week 2019. Today, we have with us Virginia Eubanks, who is an associate professor at the University at Albany, State University of New York. She has a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and she's currently in the Political Science Department at Albany. She is the author of this book, Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor, as well as a couple of other books and numerous articles. And I first became aware of her book and her through some research I was doing for an Ethics in Business Analytics and Ethics in Data Science course that I teach here at the university. And I found a Wired magazine article that focused on one of the three primary case studies in this book. Enough about her. Let's hear from her now. Please join me in welcoming Virginia Eubanks.
Hi, I just want to thank you all for braving the crazy weather to make it here. Although I was reminded on my way upstairs a little earlier that at least it's not the polar vortex. So this is somehow better weather than you had a couple of weeks ago. So I still appreciate you coming out. So thanks for coming out. I'm really excited to talk to you today. I'm going to try to maintain the whole room in my visual contact, but it's spread out a little strange, so I apologize if I miss folks on the edge. I will see you when you have questions later, I promise. Basically, how I'd like to do things today is I'm going to talk to you mostly about the reporting that I did in the 7 years of investigative reporting I did to write Automating Inequality. I will do that by sort of telling a couple of stories, one about a moment in history that becomes really sort of like the deep legacy programming of the tools that I describe in the book. The second thing I'll do is talk to you about the three different cases that I cover in the book, and I talk about an attempt to automate all of the eligibility processes for the welfare system here in the state of Indiana. The second case I talk about in the book is a system called the Coordinated Entry System, which proponents call the Match.com of homeless services. It's supposed to be able to match the most vulnerable unhoused people with the most appropriate available housing. And then the third story I talk about in the book is the story of a tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county in Pennsylvania where Pittsburgh is. So I'll tell you a little bit about those three stories, but what I'm going to do is try to introduce you to the stories, not necessarily through descriptions of the technical systems, though I think this crowd, we might want to go under the hood a little bit in the questions and answers, and I love to go down the particular rabbit hole of how the inside of the tools work, so I'm happy to have that conversation. But I feel like it's really important for you all to hear firsthand from the families who are impacted by these systems. So folks who see themselves as targets of these systems. So I'm gonna really concentrate the stories I tell on the families that I spoke to when I was doing reporting on the book. And then finally, I might just sort of draw some parallels and pull up some big themes as we move into sort of questions and answers in a larger conversation. Does that sound good to folks? Does that sound like a good way to roll it out? I'll probably talk for maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll start to transition into the conversation. I'm really excited to talk to you about the work, so please do prepare questions. So I'm here today to talk about what I call the digital poorhouse. And the digital poorhouse is this invisible institution that's increasingly being made up of decision-making algorithms, automated eligibility processes, statistical models in our nation's social service systems. And I want to talk today about how the rise of this digital poorhouse, this invisible institution, sort of responds to and recreates a narrative of austerity. This sort of idea that we don't have enough for everyone, and we have to make hard choices between those who deserve to attain their basic human rights and those who can wait. So though we really like to describe the kinds of new tools that I talk about in the book as disruptors, one of the arguments I make in the book is that they're really more evolution than revolution. And their roots go way, way, way back in our history, at least until 1820. And this is the moment at which I always sort of thank my editor on this book, Elizabeth Disegard, because originally the first chapter of the book was like a 95-page history chapter on the last 400 years of poverty policy in the United States. And she was like, oh, please don't do that to them, please. No one will want to read that book. And I listened to her because I have like a tiny amount of humility and modesty, and she was right. So I started at the quite recent date of 1820 and got the chapter down to a very svelte 25-page, 200-year history of poverty policy in the United States. I'm not going to tell you that whole history. We're just going to talk about one moment today. And the moment is 1819, when there was this huge economic dislocation in the United States, a deep, deep depression. And economic elites in the country got really nervous because there was this incredible active organizing happening among poor and working class communities for their rights and for their survival. And so economic elites of the time did what they often do, which is that they commissioned a bunch of studies. And the studies basically framed the question in a very specific way. They said, what's the real problem right now? Is the real problem poverty, the lack of access to basic resources, or is the problem what they called at the time pauperism, which meant dependence on public benefits, asking for help? So does anyone want to guess what the results of the surveys were? Was the problem poverty or dependence on public benefits, according to these economic elites? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
Probably pauperism.
You're right. So they thought the problem was not that people were struggling to meet their basic needs, but that people were asking for help from local and county resources. So they invented a new technology, which was the actual brick and mortar county poorhouse. These were institutions that were intended to incarcerate folks who asked for public aid. But you could also be, so they were quasi-voluntary, sort of like homeless shelters are officially voluntary, but you could also be sentenced to the poorhouse for vagrancy or begging or prostitution, which at the time just meant having sex when you weren't married. So, by the way, not a good time to have an active life, 1820. Sorry, I shouldn't be cute about that. It's actually really heavy, but it is true. So entering the poorhouse was not a small choice. If you had the right to vote or hold office at the time, this is 1819, so certainly not everybody in the United States had that right at that historical moment. But if you had that right, you gave it up in order to enter the poorhouse. You could not marry when you were in the poorhouse. You couldn't form a family. And if you had children, they were often separated from you because it was understood that poor children having interactions with richer families would sort of redeem them or rehabilitate them. And what they meant as interaction basically was sort of working for free as agricultural or domestic labor. And finally, the death rates at some of these institutions were incredibly high, something like 30% a year at some institutions, like one of the most famous ones in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. So people were literally taking their lives in their hands when they entered this institution. By the way, this is the weird thing I do when I come to a new city. I always look where your poorhouse was. And South Bend had one, and built in 1846 as the White Hall. It moved several times, and it ended up, anybody know this? Ended up as the St. Joseph's County Infirmary in 1907, which is now known as the Portage House. It's 3016 Portage Ave, so that used to be your poorhouse. So you should go check it out, because these are sort of amazing open secrets, right? We all know these things existed, but we all also sort of ignore that they existed. And one of the things that I really like to do when I'm talking about the book is to sort of make the connection for you guys. I believe it's now an old age home. So I use the metaphor of the digital poorhouse to illustrate what I think of as sort of the deep social programming or the legacy programming of the digital poorhouse. So this is sort of the Fortran on which everything else is built. I just dated myself really seriously by acknowledging that I know what Fortran is. And at the heart of this programming is a set of decisions we made way, way back in 1819. And that decision was that the first and most important thing that public service program should do is moral investigation, that it should spend most of its time and most of its energy deciding whether or not you deserve public assistance, rather than developing a universal floor that supports us all. So I want to not just talk about history, but I want us to think together today about this really unique moment in time that we live in, this political moment, about why these specific tools have become popular at this specific time. And I think there's kind of three reasons. The first is that they rationalize and recreate this austerity narrative I was talking about before, this idea that there's not enough for everyone, and we have to manage and balance people's needs against each other. The second is that they do a kind of what people call bias laundering, that they propose that they can eliminate discretion and bias from human services decision-making, but they really just move it and hide it. And third, that they create, at their worst, a kind of empathy override that makes it possible for us to sort of outsource the burden of making what are really increasingly inhuman decisions about who among America's 43 million people below the poverty line deserve support. I'm going to talk about each of those in turn as I talk about the different cases in the book. So the first case is the Indiana case, and we'll spend a little time with this one as it is a Hoosier-made problem and a Hoosier-made solution. So this story starts in 2006 when then Governor Mitch Daniels signed what was eventually a $1.34 billion contract, that's billion with a B, with a consortium of high-tech companies including IBM and ACS, to automate and modernize all the state's eligibility processes for their public service programs. So that's TANF, cash assistance, what most people think of when you say welfare, but also food stamps, what was called food stamps at the time is now called SNAP, and Medicaid, so medical insurance for poor and indigent folks. So what this looked like in practice was removing 1,500 local caseworkers from county offices and moving them to regionalized, privatized call centers. What that felt like from the caseworkers' point of view is where in the past they had been responsible for and responsive to sort of a list of cases, a docket of cases, a group of families or a caseload, they were now responsive only to a list of tasks as it dropped into their workflow management system on their sort of computer screen. And that was a really major shift for caseworkers because before they often developed relationships with families over time, they understood their context. Even if they were dealing with a family for the first time, they had some knowledge of the local geographic context. So for example, if you were applying for food stamps and it looked like you weren't going to be eligible, your caseworker could often say, you know, it looks like you're not going to be eligible for food stamps, but there's a food pantry in your town, it's open Tuesday nights. So that was a really big shift for caseworkers. From the recipient's point of view, it felt like no one was responsible when an error was made, that no one was accountable for mistakes. And that mistake could come anywhere in the process. It could be an applicant's mistake, right? These are really long, really complicated forms applying for public assistance. So you could have forgotten the signature on page 34 of a 50-page application. That certainly happens all the time. A mistake could be the fault of the call center workers who increasingly were new workers who didn't know a lot about the policy, so they often gave bad advice. Or it could have actually been a problem, a technical problem that happened, say, in the document center, right? So one of the kinds of documentation you have to provide when you apply for public assistance is a photo ID. In order to get it to the document center, you had to photocopy your ID and then fax it to the document center where they would then scan it. And if you can imagine what that ended up looking like was like a black box on a white sheet of paper. But that kind of error would be enough to get you deny your application for public benefits. So to clients, to folks who are applying for these programs, it felt like no matter what kind of mistake got made, the burden of figuring out the mistake and fixing it fell on you because you no longer had a caseworker that you had a relationship with who would help you sort of wade through these complicated systems. And the upshot is 1 million applications were denied in the first 3 years of the experiment. That was a 54% increase from the 3 years before the experiment. And most people were denied for this sort of catch-all reason called failure to cooperate in establishing eligibility. And that just meant that one of those mistakes had been made. But the notification that you got that said you had failed to cooperate didn't say anything about what the error was. It just complete process. And it was up to you, really, to figure out what had gone wrong and correct it. And this was an incredible burden to place on some of the state's most vulnerable families. And I just want to introduce you to one of the people that I investigated when I was doing my reporting. That's Omega Young of Evansville. So I'm just going to read a bit so you get a sense of her story and a sense of what the book sounds like. So in the fall of 2008, Omega Young of Evansville missed an appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital suffering from terminal cancer. The cancer that began in her ovaries had spread to her kidneys, breast, and liver. Her chemotherapy left her weak and emaciated. Young, a round-faced, umber-skinned mother of 2 grown sons, struggled to meet the new system's requirements. So she called her local sort of county help center in Vanderbilt County and let them know that she couldn't make this telephone appointment to recertify for Medicaid because she was in the hospital, trying to recover from cancer. But her medical benefits were still cut off for failure to cooperate in establishing eligibility. Because she lost her benefits, Young was unable to afford her medications. She lost her food stamps. She struggled to pay her rent. She lost access to free transportation to medical appointments. And Omega Young died on March 1st, 2009. On the very next day, on March 2nd, she won an appeal of the system for wrongful termination, and all of her benefits were restored the day after she died. So that's Omega's story. And one of the things that I want to point out about the story that I think is so important is that it's very much built on this narrative that there's not enough for everyone, and creating more efficient systems, particularly systems that can detect fraud or perceived fraud in the system, would make more resources available to the people who really needed it in Indiana. And I want to point out that that's clearly not what happened in this case. And in fact, 3 years into the experiment, there was so much pushback around the system, so much sort of social movement pushback, local organizations, families, local government pushback, that the governor did something really unexpected and canceled the contract 3 years into a 10-year contract. Then IBM actually turned around and sued the state of Indiana for breach of contract. Originally, were not only allowed to keep the $500 million they had already collected, but were awarded an extra $50 million in penalties for the breach of contract. That went back and forth in the courts for about 9 years, and I think the state ended up recovering $78 million of the $550 million that had gone into this project. But I think it's really important to be clear that all of that money could have gone to services. And so one of the things that, one of the patterns that we see around these tools is using this narrative of austerity to create tools that actually end up creating austerity because they end up costing so much, both in human suffering and in actual taxpayer money. So that's what I see as a really paradigmatic case of sort of automating austerity. So second point is about what people refer to as bias laundering. So many of these systems are built not just to sort of save money and be more efficient or be faster or more technically accurate, but also to specifically to identify and remove bias from human decision making. And I want to be really clear, that's incredibly important in our public service system. So discriminatory eligibility rules and human discretion have blocked the great majority of people from getting public services, the resources they need and deserve and are entitled to. Primarily people of color, but also single mothers, lesbians, folks who are never married, have for decades been blocked from getting the sort of proper access to the resources that are available to them. But I want to tell you the story of the Allegheny Family Screening Tool and want to talk a little bit about how discrimination, bias sort of moves around in these systems. And in this case, I want to start with the story of a family and then tell you about the tool instead of the opposite. So one of the families that I reported on in Allegheny County was Angel Shepherd, and bless you, Angel Shepherd and Patrick Grebe. And I met them at this sort of community support center where families that are involved with the child welfare system sort of meet to share resources, to do peer support, to do all that kinds of sort of different stuff, to connect with each other. And Angel and Patrick didn't stand out right away because their experience was really so average, so characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities of the white working class. So they've struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality public schools and predatory online education, poor health, and community violence. But through it all, they've remained really sort of engaged, innovative, interesting parents. So Patrick, I think I describe him in the book as like a Buddhist ex-biker. He's this like rectangular human being. He's like built like a wall. And he has really complicated facial hair and is very calm, like very centered, very chill guy. And Patrick and Angel are caring for two young girls. Angel's daughter, Harriet, and Patrick's daughter's daughter, Desiree. And the two girls are roughly the same age, so they bicker a lot, they fight a lot. So their solution for this is what Angel and Patrick call the get-along shirt. And the get-along shirt is just one of Patrick's sort of enormous button-down Oxford shirts that they push both the girls in. And each girl puts one arm through one of the sleeves and one arm around the waist of the other girl, and then they button the shirt back up. And you're not allowed to leave the get-along shirt until you're getting along, until you stop fighting, even if you have to go to the bathroom. And this is the thing that Patrick said works every time. As soon as someone has to pee, everyone starts getting along, because nobody wants to pee in the get-along shirt. So despite the fact that they're these just really, I think, engaged, fascinating parents, they've racked up a lifetime of interactions with what in Allegheny County, what in Pennsylvania is called Children, Youth, and Family Services, or CYF. What in other places is called CPS, Child Protective Services, or Child Welfare Services. So in the early 2000s, Patrick was investigated for medical neglect because he brought his daughter into the emergency room. They gave him a prescription for her of antibiotics. He couldn't afford the antibiotic prescription. And when she got worse, he brought her back to the emergency room. And the nurse called Children, Youth, and Family Services on him and reported him for medical neglect. When Harriet, Angel's daughter, was 5, someone phoned in a string of reports to the county child abuse and neglect hotline. So this is an anonymous caller. You don't have to give your name when you call these lines. And they explained that Harriet was running around the neighborhood unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't being properly clothed, fed, or bathed, that she wasn't getting needed medication. So for each call, an investigator came to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, and looked in all the cupboards and under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. And then in every one of these cases, they found that there was nothing going wrong in the house. There's no evidence of maltreatment, so they closed the case. But that electronic case file resides on an integrated data warehouse that is kept by the county, which feeds this tool, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is supposed to be able to risk rate families for how likely they are to abuse or neglect their children. So Angel and Patrick know this, and they really have to do this sort of day-by-day algebra in their head of when to reach out to request help or services and when to not, because they understand that many of their interactions with the county serve to raise their risk rating by this tool. So they live in what they describe to me as a kind of constant state of low-grade terror, that there will be another call on their family and that the algorithm will target either their daughter or their granddaughter for investigation and possibly for removal to foster care. So Angel told me, you feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it's not good enough for them. My daughter's now 9, and I'm still afraid that they're going to come up one day, see her out by herself, pick her up, and say, you can't have her anymore. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, the short version of this is probably the most technically complicated tool I talk about in the book. The short version of the history is that Allegheny County built an integrated data warehouse in 1999. As of the writing of the book, it held 1 billion records, more than 800 for every individual who lives in the county. but it doesn't collect information equally on all different folks. In fact, it really only has access to data on folks who reach out to the county or to the state for support with their parenting. So it gets regular data extracts from, for example, the County Office of Mental Health, the County Office of Addiction and Recovery, the State Office of Income Maintenance, which is sort of Pennsylvania's welfare system, the Office of Children, Youth, and Families itself, the jails and prisons, adult and juvenile probation, and the public schools. Now the problem is that means that the data set is limited in really specific and very patterned, importantly patterned ways. So it is unable to see the kinds of harm that might be happening in communities that are not represented in the data warehouse. So professional middle class families also need lots of help with their parenting, because everybody needs lots of help with their parenting. But they often can pay for it out of pocket or with private insurance. So if you need help with childcare, you hire a nanny or a babysitter. If you need help with addiction recovery or with a mental health issue, you go and see your doctor, but it's paid for with employer-provided insurance, so it's private, and none of that ends up in this database. And that was an issue for both parents and for workers in the system. So parents, as you might imagine, were really concerned about false positives, about the statistical model seeing harm where no harm actually existed or was likely to happen. So they told me that they felt like the system confused parenting while poor with poor parenting, that it was a kind of poverty profiling, that because they were over-surveyed, because they were involved in these county data systems, more risk was recognized in their neighborhoods. Because more risk was recognized in their neighborhoods, they were investigated more, which added more data to the system, which meant they were risk rated higher, which meant they were investigated more, and that sort of closes what they think of as a feedback loop of injustice. Now, what's interesting is I also spent a lot of time with the frontline caseworkers in the system. So these are what are known as call screeners, and they're people who pick up the phone when the county hotline, abuse or neglect hotline rings, or who look at the mandated reports from folks like teachers and nurses who are legally required to report any suspicion they have of abuse or neglect to the state. And they make a really difficult decision. They decide whether to screen a case in for a full investigation by Children, Youth, and Family Services, or whether to screen it out, keep the record in the system, and see what happens. So intake call screeners, interestingly, were also concerned about the limitations of the data set, but from the opposite angle. So they felt that because the system couldn't see the kinds of harms that might be happening in professional middle-class families, that it might be missing harm that was happening to children. So they were really concerned with what are known as false negatives, right? So not seeing harm where harm might actually be occurring. So for example, there's pretty good evidence in the academic literature, at least, that geographic isolation is pretty highly correlated with abuse or neglect. But those families won't show up in this system because those are families who are not relying on county or state resources, right? So intake call screeners were really concerned about the limitations in the data set, but for the opposite reason. Back to this question of bias. So one of the reasons that the tools designers give for creating this system is to pay attention to patterns of decision-making among these call screeners I talked about, specifically to try to remove racial bias from the system, and that's actually really important. So 47 states around the country, Black and African American children are removed from their homes at rates that far surpass their proportion of the population. It's an issue that's known as racial disproportionality in child welfare. And Allegheny County, like just about everywhere, has a real issue with racial disproportionality. So though Black and biracial youth only make up about 18% of the youth population, they are taken out of their families 38% of the time. So it's they're more than twice as likely, more than twice as likely to be taken out of their homes as they should be, given their proportion in the population. So this intention to keep an eye on racial discrimination is really important. However, the county's own research actually shows that this isn't the point at which racial discrimination is entering the system. This is the point of screening, where you decide whether to investigate a family or not. Actually, where racial discrimination is entering the system is at the point at which families are referred. So it's referral bias, not screening bias. So Black and biracial families get called on by mandated reporters in this anonymous hotline 3.5 times more often than white families. So my real concern here is this idea that you are removing discretion, discriminatory discretion from the system is simply not true. And I have a very smart political science friend named Joe Sauce, and he says discretion is like energy. It can never be created or destroyed. It can only be moved. And in this system, what we see is discretion being removed from the front line of child, youth, and family services and being given to the folks who are designing the tool. And I think that that assumption that the folks designing these tools necessarily have fewer biases than the folks working the front line of the system, I think is something we really need to think deeply about. Particularly because the front line of the system is the most female, is the most working class, and is the most racially diverse part of the workforce. Okay, finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about the Los Angeles system. I want to sort of wrap this up in about 5 minutes. How's our energy? People still okay? Happy twinkle fingers if you're still okay. Downward twinkle fingers if you want to get out of here. It's okay. You can do it. You can say it. No, oh, y'all are so nice. Oh, there's one. Okay, that's all right. I was just going to say how polite Midwesterners are, and you just ruined it for me. Thank you for your honesty. Well, I'll go for about 5 more minutes, and then we'll wrap up. So one of my real fears about these systems is at their worst, they act as a kind of empathy override, meaning they give us the space to outsource some of the most difficult decisions we have to make as a society. And they depoliticize those choices. They make them seem like neutral, objective, apolitical decisions, when in fact they're deeply political decisions. So for example, the system that I looked at in Los Angeles, the coordinated entry system, is actually really common across the country and increasingly around the world. The reason I studied it in Los Angeles County is that Los Angeles has 58,000 unhoused people living there. So I live in a small city in upstate New York called Troy. My entire city plus 8,000 people are homeless in LA. And something like, it's actually not the most homeless in any city, it's the second most. New York City is higher, they have 76,000 homeless people in New York City. The difference in Los Angeles is that roughly 75% of unhoused people are completely unsheltered, meaning they have no access to emergency shelter or overnight shelter. They're just living in encampments on the sidewalks or in parks or under freeways or in cars. So this is an extraordinary, if you've ever spent time in homeless encampments around Los Angeles, this is an extraordinary human rights crisis. It is really, really incredibly difficult to think about how we're going to respond to suffering that is this deep. So I understand where the impulse to build a technical system that can make those decisions for you comes from. I don't want to be the caseworker that says, I saw 100 people this week and I can only give 2 people resources. I don't want to be the person making that decision either, right? So I understand the impulse. But it's important to know a little bit about how this system works and know why I'm concerned about the ethics of the system. So it works basically by assigning each unhoused person a score on a spectrum of vulnerability. And they do this with a very intensive survey called the VI-SPDAT, terrible acronym. It stands for Vulnerability Index and Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. And it asks some really intrusive, invasive questions. So it asks, are you currently trading sex for money? Is there someone out there that thinks you owe them money? Do you have outstanding warrants out there? Where can you be found at different times of the day? Have you been thinking about hurting yourself or someone else? And it asks if it can take a picture. So these questions are not bad indicators of your level of vulnerability. It's not actually a bad instrument. But the context in which it's being used makes the sort of ethical questions around it a little bit more complicated. So once they get the data from this survey, and they've managed to survey about 39,000 people as of the writing of the book, They enter it into the county's homeless management information system, which is a technical crowd, so it's not actually a database, and that matters. It's a set of fields that are standardized across different areas of practice, but let's just call it a database for now. They enter this data into the HMIS. There's an algorithm in the HMIS that counts, that figures out your vulnerability on a scale of 0 to 17. At the same time, there's information about housing opportunities entering the other side of the system, and then there's supposed to be an algorithm in the middle that matches people based on their vulnerability score with opportunities based on their eligibility criteria. As of the writing of the book, there's supposed to be an algorithm doing that. It was actually a Mechanical Turk. It was actually like a guy sitting in a room, like reading them and matching them up, which I just always think is really interesting. But that is the intention of the system. So as of the time I was writing the book, they had surveyed 39,000 people. They had managed to find resources for about 9,000 of them. And that doesn't mean that 9,000 people got apartments. Some people got apartment keys, and I talked to some of the folks who were housed through coordinated entry. But it could also be the much more limited resources of rapid rehousing. So things like a couple $100s to fight an eviction, or a bus ticket to go live with family, or these other sort of much more time-limited and much more resource-limited supports. So any one of those counted as a match in the system. So they managed to get 9,000 people some kind of match in the system. But I was really interested in the 30,000 people who had gone through this process of this very intrusive survey and being entered into this often sort of opaque database, who'd been surveyed but who had not been served with any kind of resources at all. I was really interested in how they felt about the system. And these are folks like Gary Boatwright, a guy who goes by the nickname Uncle Gary, who I met in the encampments in Skid Row. I just want to tell you a little bit about Gary, and then we'll wrap up. So when I met Uncle Gary Boatwright, he was living in a gray and green tent on East 6th Street on the edge of Skid Row in downtown LA. He's a straight-talking, really funny guy with sort of thinning white hair and just ocean blue eyes. He's had a dozen careers. He was a welder, a mason, a paralegal, a door-to-door salesman, a law student, and most recently he was a document processor for a wholesale mortgage lender. Since he moved to Skid Row, he had filled out the VI SPDAT 3 times and had really lost patience with the process. He doesn't think he scored very high on the vulnerability scale because though he's 64, other than a little bit of high blood pressure and a hearing problem, he's mostly healthy. His substance use to me didn't seem abusive or debilitating. And he has a mental health diagnosis, but he actually doesn't know what it is. He was only told he had one when he went to court in Orange County, and they never shared his diagnosis with him. So he said he couldn't be sure how that affected his score. But the problem, as he saw it, was not his comparative vulnerability compared to the guy who lives in the tent next to him. It was simple math. There's not enough housing in Los Angeles for the county's 58,000 unhoused people. So he told me, people like me who are somewhat higher functioning, we're not getting housing. It's another way of kicking the can down the road. In order to house the homeless, you have to have the available units. Show me the units, otherwise you're lying. So in November of 2016, Gary was arrested. He was charged with breaking the window of a public bus with a plastic 99-cent store broom. When he got out about a year ago, he had lost everything: his tent, his paperwork, his relationships with local organizations and friends who helped keep him safe. And if he chooses to interact with the coordinated entry system again, he'll actually score lower on the VI SPDAT because it counts incarceration as being housed. So the model will see him as less vulnerable, and his priority score will slip even lower. So what's really one of the really important sort of analyses that Gary had was, he told me it felt like he was being asked to incriminate himself for a slightly higher lottery number for housing based on the questions in the VI SPDAT. And this actually is not a bad analysis of the system because under current federal data standards, information in the HMIS can be shared with law enforcement with no warrant process at all, like not even a written request, just an oral request. So a line officer can walk into a social service office and ask for information out of this set of databases. And the social service worker is not required to give it to them, but they are allowed to give it to them even if they don't have a warrant or any kind of written request. My greatest fear here is that these tools, by sort of act as empathy overrides. They radically limit our political vision around how to solve really complex and crucial issues like the housing crisis, and they absolve us from a responsibility to sort of care for each other. I can hear skeptics now, right? Virginia, like, you want to sell books, you went out, you found the scariest stories you could find, you put them all in one book, and you're trying to scare us into buying the thing. And here's the reality. Actually, the Indiana story is pretty bad. If you want to read the Indiana story, it's not great. I don't know what was in Mitch Daniels' heart when he made the sort of political decisions that created the context for this system. But I can say that one of my sources in Bloomington said, if we had built this system on purpose to deny people access to public services, it would not have worked any better. But one of the things I want people to consider is that it's not so much people's intentions that matter around this design as impacts on the people who are most affected by these systems. And the reality is that in both Los Angeles and Allegheny County, the folks who designed these systems actually did most of the things that progressive critics of algorithmic decision-making asked them to do. They were largely transparent. They released information about what was in their models so you could look at it. They were largely accountable. They placed these tools in public agencies, or at least public-private partnerships, so there's some kind of democratic control over how they're being used. And they even used some participatory design, like they worked with caseworkers and administrators to develop the tools in a participatory way. So I think if you look at the cases in Los Angeles and Allegheny County as not the worst cases, but actually some of the best, then that leaves you with a different set of questions. And I think one of the most difficult questions I pose in the book is what if the problem with the coming age of AI and machine learning and social services is not broken systems, not systems that are flawed, but systems that carry out our political imperatives too well. Those imperatives that go all the way back to the actual physical brick and mortar poorhouse, which is to divert people from public assistance, to control their political activity and their families, and to control. And the last one I forgot. Rule of threes, I try to find three, but sometimes you miss stuff. So what if the systems are not broken, but they're working too well? So all the designers I talked to for this book agreed on one thing. They said that these tools were sometimes regrettable, but they were necessary systems for doing a kind of digital triage, for deciding who should get access to limited resources and who can wait. But one of the challenges I levy in the book is the challenge to realize that this decision to do triage is itself a political choice. That we live actually in a country of abundance and not scarcity, and that there is enough for everyone. It actually is not appropriate to use the language of triage in this situation. Triage is only really appropriate if there are more resources coming. So in these contexts where there aren't more resources coming without a political commitment to make that happen, what we're doing is not triage, it's actually automated rationing. And I think we deserve better, and that's why I wrote the book. We deserve better, our people deserve better, our communities deserve better. I really think the fundamental danger of the digital poorhouse is this demand that we think small, that we work within these arbitrary limits, both on our resources and in our vision, to our vision. And I think this political moment and justice itself demands that we think big, that we push back against this austerity fever, this myth that there's not enough for everyone. I'm happy to talk about solutions in the question and answer period more specifically, but one of the things I want to raise just in closing is that this idea that we should spend so much of our time, so many of our resources, and so many smart people making increasingly sophisticated moral thermometers that decides who deserves help is not necessary, natural, or inevitable. In fact, we can decide as a political community that there is a line below which no one should go for any reason, right? No one in the United States should go hungry. No one in the United States should live in a tent on the sidewalk for a decade or more. No family in the United States should be split up because the parents can't afford a child's medication. In other places around the world, these things are very quickly identified as human rights violations. And here in the United States, that we're increasingly talking about them as systems engineering problems, actually I think says something really deep and important about the state of our national soul and about who we are as a people. So if we're gonna have a more just digital future, we have to build it on purpose, sort of bit by bit and bite by bite. If we outsource our moral responsibility to care for each other to computers, we really have no one but ourselves to blame when these systems supercharge discrimination and automate austerity. I appreciate your attention and your time, and I'm really looking forward to questions. So thank you so much for being here. Do folks have questions? Yeah. And do we want to do a circulating mic for the video? Do you need a? I can also just repeat the question. So let's do that. Yeah.
So I kind of addressed it at the end when we started talking about how it was more of a back-end issue with not enough resources for the system to decide. I don't know if when you were looking at like the Allegheny County stuff, if you ever looked at Singapore and how they kind of run their welfare system. I think it's like 80% of the housing is public housing, and like they have a lot of systems like this, but it's also a lot more authoritative where there are a lot more cameras, government's a lot more involved in your life. Do you think that those kind of systems would fix the discrimination if everyone was being watched equally at that level? Or do you think that would ever happen in a very non-authoritative country like ours?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is there a comparison here to, say, Singapore, where the public assistance systems are much more generous, but it comes with a trade-off in sort of privacy and autonomy, like that you're watched much more than we would be comfortable with. I actually think there's also a good comparison to the social credit system in China, right, which raises a similar question, which is, which one's better? Is it better to have an authoritarian system that's looking at everyone equally, but in really kind of creepy and bad ways? Or is it better to have a system where we only do that to poor and working people? And I think it's a question like the draft, right? Like, is it better to have a, quote, voluntary army that's mostly people of color and mostly poor and working class people, or a draft that spreads the pain out, right? So I think that's a question of values, of social values, of balancing our legitimately competing values. But I will say that there are systems that have much more generous public benefits that don't have those kind of authoritarian regimes. So I've spent a lot of time in Scandinavia. I went very recently, I went to talk to the Association of Nordic Social Workers. And one of the things that was really interesting about that conference is like the Nordic countries are known for having really incredibly participatory democracy and incredibly generous social benefits. And so we're at the dinner before this conference and I'm supposed to speak at, I'm talking to the organizers and I'm like, come on, why did you actually invite me, right? Like, do you just invite Americans so you can feel better about yourself when we describe like the horrors of our social service system? And they were like, well, yeah, a little bit, yeah. And then they were like, but really, what's happening for us is in Finland, about a year and a half ago, they had a set of elections that, at least for the folks that I was spending time with, were really troubling to them. So one, they said the turnout was embarrassingly, frighteningly low. It was only 89%, right? And they were horrified that a presidential election should have less than 99% turnout, which is their normal. And they elected someone who the folks I was with saw as being sort of emblematic of this larger move towards ethnic nationalism. They're really concerned about him. And they said, why we invited you is because we live in a country where there's this huge amount of trust between the government and its citizens, right? So they have a national ID card that has their health information on it because they have national health. It often has their housing information, employment information. It has all of this biometrics, all of this stuff on it. And they had never really thought that might be an issue until this election. And then they were like, you know, with this regime change, we suddenly thought like, oh my, like, what have we done? Like now this new regime has access to all this information that maybe we wouldn't have given it to them if we had known. And I think that's actually a really important thing to think about, right? Like, how do you build tools that have values in them that that are like hardened, right? That you can't use, you can't hack, unhackable values. And that's true in the United States as well. So if you look at the DACA database, for example, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals database, this under an Obama administration, the intention was to collect information about young people who had been brought into the country and didn't have legal status, in order to sort of get them citizenship under something like a DREAM Act. Under the new administration, it very potentially could be used as a deportation list. So that is, I think, a really big, important question to think about is like, is it possible to build these systems with unhackable democratic values? Values like self-determination and autonomy and due process. And I think that's a really tough question that we're gonna have to involve a lot of people in answering. My main point is that these systems are political decision-making systems. They're not simple administrative upgrades. And as such, we should all be talking about their political effects. So I think that's a great question. That's a great way to get at it, is to say like, well, how different are we really than India's Aadhaar system, or than the Chinese social credit system, or the sort of like intense surveillance of Singapore? Or are we more like, are our values more in line with places like Finland or Norway? And those are some big questions that we should be talking about that we're making invisible by sort of putting them behind this facade of neutral objective technology. It's a great question. It's a long answer, but it's a deep question. Thank you for that. Other stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, so as a software engineer, if you're approached by an organization and asked to make like some kind of database or program for them, like what are the kinds of questions you should be asking so you can avoid like these broad, harmful trends like databases or algorithms that you
Yeah.
write?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that. So this has come up for me. I even have a slide for this that we skipped earlier. So this has come up for me a lot from the other direction, which is since the book has come out, I hear a lot from organizations that are serving poor and working class communities. And they're often being asked to like consult on these systems. They're like, okay, so our child welfare system is moving towards predictive analytics and they want to know what we think. And they're like, we know a lot about the political issues, we know a lot about the lives of our people, but we don't necessarily know the difference between a predictive variable and an outcome variable. Like, so can you help us sort of articulate the kinds of questions we might want to ask? And I think they and you want to be asking similar questions, right? So I feel like there's like a level 0, which is like basement level values that have to be in all these systems. So that's about transparency. Can we see what's in them if they're going to impact our lives politically? Accountability, like is there some way we have levers to change them? And maybe you know, some kind of participatory design where the people who are going to be affected have some kind of input into the process of design. So those feel like the level 0 things. But these conversations I've been having with organizations have turned up a lot of other kinds of issues that aren't quite making it onto that agenda. And this sort of illustrates some of them. One is, I think a really good question to ask is the use of analytics being accompanied by increased resources. If the use of analytics is being introduced under conditions of increasing austerity, then it almost guarantees the system is going to act to divert people from getting resources they need to survive and thrive. So one of the examples I use, often also people are like, so you hate data? And I'm like, well, no. Like, I'm talking about sort of specific arrangements of these programs that are having bad impacts on the people I care most about. But an example, a good example I can give you in a sense is in education at the University of Georgia. A couple of years ago, they moved to using predictive analytics in their advising, in their college advising. You know this case perhaps. And they went, this is a large state university, very diverse population, lots of first generation college students. Advising and retention is really important. Their retention had been quite low in the past, and they raised it by something like 35%, like a really incredible success story in retaining struggling students. What's so interesting about the story, though, is I'd seen reports of this tool over and over and over again, and the lead was always like, math saves students, right? Predictive analytics wins the day. And then I dug into the story a little bit because I had heard it so much, and what doesn't get reported is in the time period that they went to predictive analytics, they also hired 40 plus new full-time advisors. They went from doing 12,000 advising appointments a year to doing something like 60,000 advising appointments a year, right? And so it feels to me like the lead on that story is like, adequate resources solve real problem, not so much like predictive analytics wins the day. Granted, the predictive analytics may have really helped them decide they needed 40 new people and they hired them, but that's a case where the use of analytics is being accompanied by increased resources. And I feel like those systems are much more likely to not have the kind of effects that I write about in the book. I won't talk about all of these things, but I will talk about one or two other ones that I think are really important. So number 5 here is around securing data, and that's something that we all feel, I think, pretty comfortable around. We talk about privacy all the time. It's an important part of our solutions. One of the things that didn't make it onto the slide, but I've been thinking a lot about, is about the collection of the data, though. Is the collection of the data non-coercive? And I don't think in any of the cases that I look at in this book, the collection of the data can really be seen as being truly voluntary, right? If coordinated entry becomes the front door for all housing resources in Los Angeles County, it's hard to say that people are really volunteering this information. And so we really need to think about the power relationships that exist in data collection and decide what level of coercion we're comfortable with. You know, are you comfortable with no coercion? Are you comfortable with some coercion, like for people's, like paternal coercion, if it's in people's best interests, right? Like where's your line on coercion is a good question to be asking yourself. And finally, sort of 7 and 8 I'll talk about together. Is there remedy? Like, are there mechanisms for solving the problems that these tools create in people's lives? So for example, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, if you're highly risk rated and you end up with an investigation for neglect or abuse, and you're found what's called indicated, because you're not found guilty because this burden of proof is so low in the child welfare system, then you end up in a registry, an abuse and neglect registry for the state. If you're in that registry, you can't get a job caring for children, you can't be a teacher's aide in your children's school, you can't be a soccer coach, right? You can't be a home health aide, right? So many of the professions that most poor and working families use to support themselves then become impossible for you to attain. So this has really profound consequences for people's lives. And being listed in one of these registries often lasts for 10 years after your youngest child turns 20. So as much as 30 years, potentially. So this is a really life-changing moment. And right now, all we can do is maybe expunge you from that registry if you can prove that they made a mistake, but you have no access to counsel. So it's a civil matter, not a criminal matter, so there's no free lawyers. So you have to do it yourself. You basically have to go up against the state in court yourself to get out of one of these things. And that isn't even remedy. That's just getting expunged when they made a mistake, right? So like that next step of like, there has to be some kind of policy lever, some kind of way to say like, if you've been harmed by one of these systems, there should be a mechanism for remedy. And I don't think we're actually very close to those last two at all, to these figuring out what the systems for remedy are, or for figuring out how to do non-coercive data collection. I don't think we're even really having conversations about that yet, and I'd like us to. It's a great question. Thank you. Other folks? I have a couple minutes left. Yeah.
So I'd like to dig a little more into the Allegheny tool.
Sure.
It seems like that's a very different problem than the other two, where you're not making a decision to grant or deny access to government benefits. You're basically deciding whether or not to force government services on someone, right? And when you think about evaluating a model like that, usually we talk about weighting different types of errors. You mentioned false positives and false negatives, right? So the consequences of a false positive error are certainly negative and on the family that's involved and undesirable. But the consequences of a false negative error where a child is harmed could be tragic. Right, I'm wondering, like, was there a sort of weighted evaluation done of this model, and what did it yield? Because it seems like the true errors here aren't necessarily the flags that are being made by the system, but follow-on mistakes that are made by people acting on those indications.
So there was a really substantive ethical review of the system, both by a group of folks who are at the University of Auckland, where Rima Vaidyanathan, who's the economist who developed this model, is situated, and by two separate sort of organizations in Allegheny County. And they very much came back by doing that balance, by saying, yeah, false positives are bad, but in some ways false negatives are worse, right? Because we'll use every tool at our disposal to protect the county's children. So I think the problem, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that there's a power dynamic that we're not really talking about, where the false positives hurt poor people and the false negatives help rich people, right? So they're basically both outcomes hurt poor people, and we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the tool having differential effects on different communities of people. So that's one thing that I think we...
How would a false negative would impact that same child who's being screened out, right? I don't follow it helps rich people.
It helps them not be, it doesn't necessarily help poor children, right? But let me restate it. So false positives create sort of hyper visibility for poor families, right? Where they become part of a sort of digital surveillance system that even if they're found not indicated of abuse or neglect, really has super profound effects. Like once you make the decision to investigate a family, it changes that family forever. False negatives act as a protective layer against government intrusion for wealthier families. So that might not be good for the children, but it is a kind of protection from the kind of scrutiny that I talk about for the family taken as a whole. I had a second point, and now that I went back, I might have forgotten it. So the false positives and false negatives, the balance, the ethical review. So one of the things the ethical review said is, right, they're not using this tool to remove children from the families, and they're not. Like that is after an investigative process that involves not just CYF, but also the courts. But they are just looking for the families that might need extra support. I think that's a laudable goal. But the reality of these systems is that they are profoundly life-altering once you come in contact with them, even if it turns out okay for you. So Angel and Patrick, for example, had this really ambivalent relationship to CYF, where on one hand they said, you know what, the services that we got from them helped us stay in our house. They provided us with parenting classes that actually weren't terrible. Like, we learned things from them. We actually think we're better parents from coming into contact with this agency. On the other hand, we live in a state of constant low-grade terror that they're going to take our kids. And so I really feel like the sort of root of the complexities around the system are around, like, what do we want our child protective system to do? I think it raises really similar issues with incarcerations, like the same kind of thing around, say, risk models used in sentencing or in probation, this kind of negative freedom, this ability to not be interfered with by the government. Patrick and Angel had this incredibly ambivalent relationship to the system because the system does two things that maybe don't actually go very well together, which is they're like the system of last resort for poor families, especially now that we don't have the kind of social services that we used to have to support families. Increasingly, families are drawing on CYF to try to get access to food and safe housing. But that system also has the ability to pull the kids out of your house and put them in foster care, to separate your family. And I don't know that that's a problem that a data system can solve. I feel like one of the real concerns I have around these systems is they allow us to avoid those kinds of contradictions, those kinds of issues, by sort of providing this overly simplistic, like, well, that family's a 16, so we're going to investigate them, or that family's a 4, so we're not. Like, it means we're not having these conversations about, like, the deep ambivalence and cost and benefits that we see. And I think that's actually a really important conversation to have. That's actually one of the things that makes me most nervous about these systems, that they allow us to avoid those hard conversations. Yeah. Does that answer? Yeah.
I think we've come to the end of our time now, but having talked with Virginia earlier, she's willing to stay around and take questions on a
Yeah.
more individual,
I'll just stand up
smaller
here.
group basis, but we realize that some of you have to go elsewhere. Thank you for coming out, and please join me in thanking our